But ideas themselves don't make revolution. Philosophers don't make revolutions. They're necessary, but they're not sufficient. For ideas to make revolutions, they must first be turned into an ideology. So what is an ideology? This is actually a philosopher by the name of John Kekes, and this is his interpretation, which I really like. An ideology is a worldview that makes sense of the prevailing political conditions and suggests ways of improving them. Typical ideologies include, among their elements, a metaphysical outlook that provides a God's eye view of the world, a theory about human nature, a system of values whose realization will supposedly ensure human well-being, an explanation of why the actual state of affairs falls short of that perfection, and a set of policies intended to close the gap between the actual and the ideal. Right? It's this last component, a commitment to a political program and its implementation, that distinguishes ideologies from religious, personal, aesthetic, or philosophical systems of belief. Ideologies aim to transform society. Other systems of belief do not involve such a commitment. If they do, they become ideological. Again, this applies to all the things that we're going to be studying today. They all follow the same pattern. So the first ones to actually take a philosophy and turn it into a revolutionary ideology were the Jacobins and their leader, Maximilien Robespierre. You must have all been somewhat familiar with Robespierre. The Jacobins were the really radical political party during the French Revolution, and Robespierre was their leader. He was a strict believer in Rousseau, which is why we bothered to go through all of that. He was trying to implement the ideas of Rousseau. That was his stated goal, right? And he believed he was anointed to implement Rousseau's vision. You know, that's actually a word that I think applies to him. He feels anointed. And it was left to Robespierre and the revolutionaries to take the ideas of Rousseau and turn them into a revolutionary ideology. So one pressing question remained: what's the general will? Well, since Rousseau doesn't have an answer, doesn't provide one, it was left to Robespierre to come up with that. If you're going to have a political program and you're going to lead, you've got to answer these fundamental questions. So his answer was this: as the leader of the Revolutionary Party, he was the one who was best positioned to decide what the general will required. Right? The general will is what Robespierre says it is. Right? This is the point in which we can begin to see the disconnect between this idealistic philosophy and the political ideology, and the breakdown between the two. So the revolution that was based, in their view, on reason and the general will, in reality, as in any political situation, it was grounded in a political struggle between the revolutionaries, and they represented the working poor of Paris, the so-called sans-culottes, which referred to their dress, their pants, actually. And it was a struggle between them and the elements of the old regime. There was, there was tension, there was friction, there was differences of opinion, as you might expect. But the Jacobins were clearly on the side of the working poor, the sans-culottes, and also the Paris Commune, which was their political organization in Paris. Their philosophy, based on Rousseau, rejects the traditional religious view of the infinite value of each individual. And I think this is important. This is fundamental. Good and evil is not based on any moral category, but whether you support the revolutionary cause or not. The sans-culottes were identified as the good, and the old clergy and the old aristocracy were evil. They were bad. The government, under Robespierre, they came up with this civil constitution of the clergy, and they required that the priests pledge their allegiance to the state and not to the Pope. And they literally could be arrested, they'd even be executed if they refused to do so. This is actually pretty significant because, as historian McAfee says, the civil constitution of the clergy is the moment which fatally fractured the revolution. In the end, it proved impossible to reconcile a church based on divinely ordained hierarchy with a revolution based on popular sovereignty. And then, of course, in January of 1793, the revolutionaries executed the king, Louis XVI, and Queen Marie Antoinette, and they abolished feudalism. So the revolutionaries then, they created enemies both within the nation and with their surrounding nations as well. This led to civil war and also wars with their neighboring countries. Right? Again, this is all but with an attempt to base their nation on reason. To address the rebellion within the country, they created the Revolutionary Army of these working poor, the sans-culottes. And they were charged with enforcing the will of the government and eliminating opponents. The question so many people ask is, how is it possible that the revolutionaries committed to creating a government based on reason, not on tradition or superstition, could end up in the reign of terror? So to replace the superstition grounded in the Judeo-Christian mythology and self-interest created by private property, and to create a government based on reason and virtue, they labeled those who oppose them as tyrants, as enemies of the people, and they went about trying to eliminate them. So the revolutionaries said, so this is Kekes, who's one of my favorite philosophers. Uncorrupted human beings just intuitively recognize and act in the general interest. So any divergence between an individual and the general interest indicates the individual's immorality and irrationality. If any individual fails to see that his true interests are the same as the general interest, he must be forced to act as if he did see it for his own good. And I would add to that, or be eliminated. And of course, remember, who determines what's in the general interest? It's the government. It's Robespierre. I hope you recognize a kind of pattern here, right? We're studying this because this is the first time it happens, but it's not the last. And even Robespierre, this is a quote from him. He was known, by the way, as the virtuous in the revolution. But at the height of the terror, he says, without virtue, terror is deadly. But without terror, virtue is impotent. And also, terror is only justice, prompt, severe, inflexible. It is an emanation of virtue. Right? There's another quote too. We must smother the internal and external enemies of the Republic or perish with it. Now, in this situation, the first maxim of your policy ought to be to lead the people by reason and the people's enemies by terror. So the reign of terror wasn't a bug in the system. It was a feature. It was built in from the beginning. When each person, I might add, does not have the infinite value that comes from God, but is only considered valuable based on their ability for reason, then good and evil is simply decided by whether you're on the right side or not. And eventually, they all turned on each other, of course. Not surprisingly, people like a shopkeeper could be executed for selling sour wine because somebody accused him of being anti-revolutionary. Of course, you recognize there's an incredible potential for abuse of the system. And frankly, in the end, the revolutionaries themselves turned on Robespierre because he was eliminating all his political enemies. And finally, they eliminated him. And there's this great quote this was from a revolutionary. He was a member of a different party, the Girondins, who was executed by Robespierre. He says, "It is to be feared that the revolution, like Saturn, will end up devouring its own children." Which is exactly what happened. So again, we're back to the same slide, the same point. Once you eliminate God and redefine human nature and redefine what's good as what's in line with what the government wants, then anybody who doesn't agree, well, what do you do with them? Historically, that question is answered in this way. They are identified as enemies of the people, enemies of the government, enemies of the state, and they have to be eliminated.